Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the comeback album from D'Angelo and the Vanguard, titled Black Messiah. So imagine you're a music critic for a major publication, and you've just finished submitting your picks for the year-end list of the best albums of the year. A stressful choice, to be sure, and a list that will inevitably be inundated by angry protests and comments why other albums weren't chosen, but you're secure enough in your picks. It's not like anybody drops albums in December that are worth caring about, right? Wait a minute, didn't I say all this last year with Beyonce's self-titled album that effectively came out of nowhere? Well, if anything, this release might be even more surprising from one of the most critically acclaimed and respected and yet reclusive R&B artists to ever chart. One of the men responsible for starting the neo-soul movement of the 90s with music drenched in the iconography of the past while still making sounds that felt relevant and very modern. Yep, we're talking about D'Angelo, an R&B star who emerged on a wave of potent buzz in the mid-90s with his debut Brown Sugar, which eventually became a commercial success but was a critical darling right out of the gate. And having revisited that album since then, I can definitely see why. D'Angelo wasn't exactly a forceful presence behind the microphone, but he didn't need to be. The man wrote very slick, beautifully textured music, had buckets of charisma and sensuality, and was a pretty damn good songwriter to boot. This is a guy who was a peer of Usher, R. Kelly, Raphael Sadiq, and Boyz II Men, and yet he stayed away from much of the histrionics of the times to stick with more subtle, restrained, yet just as passionate music. As such, his albums have a timeless feel to them that's impossible to fake. This is a guy who could cover Smokey Robinson's classic Cruisin' and do it justice, and honestly, that's pretty damn impressive. Now from there, D'Angelo took several years off and came back with Voodoo in 2000, and while I can't say I was the biggest fan to move to a more groove-centric direction over melodies, it doesn't make the album any less great. And make no mistake, Voodoo is a damn great record. Smooth as hell, funky, poetic, and sexy too. It was Voodoo's commercial hits that led to D'Angelo becoming a sex symbol in R&B, which sadly was one of the reasons that he stopped touring and putting out music. Between that and some personal problems, he took a long hiatus from recording on his own projects, vanishing from the spotlight outside of a few scattered guest appearances. And while there had been a lot of rumors throughout the past decade that D'Angelo was gonna make that third album, it was often compared to the long nascent project Smile by Brian Wilson, a record that was actually completed 10 years ago after decades in development, and is goddamn amazing, by the way. And yet, in one of the biggest surprises of the new year, D'Angelo is actually back with a new album. From the rave reviews and sheer panic from sites that had already published their year-end list in order to praise this album, I had to hear this record. So, I checked out Black Messiah. How is it? Well, unsurprisingly, it's awesome. There are cases where I disagree with the majority of critics, but this is not one of them. Because Black Messiah is exactly the sort of comeback album that I wanted to hear from D'Angelo. Refreshingly modern in its tone and lyrics, even experimental in its approach and sound, and yet from the analog recording to the rich organic palette on the table, this is an album that feels heavily indebted to the greats in funk, soul, gospel, and 70s R&B, with a hefty load of Prince as well, especially in the lyrics. And a year that has featured some of the strongest comebacks from R&B and soul on record, this is the perfect way to end out the year. A strikingly potent and textured album that might just be one of the best records to drop this year, bar none. So let's start with the change that I expected but still definitely appreciated. D'Angelo's voice. Nearly 15 years has aged his voice from the smoother crooning tones, added a little bit of roughness to it, and I can't tell you how much it just works against this brand of production. He still has his incredible range, but expanding beyond his whispers into more full-throated singing is a perfect choice, especially when the songs venture away from the bedroom to more hard-edged political material. Now, sure, his voice can come across as a little bit nasal at points, but part of that is age, and it's an element that doesn't feel put upon or an imitation of those old-school funk and soul singers of the past. Now, I mentioned the production and the instrumentation had gotten a little bit rougher, and it's probably one of the best features of this album. Great, sharp drum work, wheedling guitars that aren't afraid to get a little bit more aggressive and distorted, which you don't typically see in neo-soul. Very prominent melody lines that might start to come across as basic until you start untangling the subtleties and the harmonies. Make no mistake, this is one you want to hear on a really good sound system. And, of course, phenomenal bass work from Pino Palladino. And all of it is through production that is spacious yet very intimate, with sharp textured edges but still incredibly melodic and smooth. From that opening rollick on the groove and Ain't That Easy to the stuttered hand claps, there's an analog warmth to this record that has some warmth and presence but also some experimental or slightly off-kilter turns that call back to great jazz and funk. And the great instrumental moments, they just kept on coming. The bubbling funk of A Thousand Deaths with a subtle growl to the guitar and D'Angelo's voice beneath a layer of fuzz that breaks breaks for these warped howls against a squealing guitar solo, the firm up-tempo bass and drums on the charade against the interweaving guitar melodies and subtle trombones, the rollicking tap of the beat, the horns, the slightly off-kilter piano line, and the swirling warped vocals of Sugar Daddy, the glorious strings transition into this Spanish guitar that builds into this fantastically textured slow jam on Really Love, the subtle crackle of the pick guitars, strings, and what sounds like a harp on Back to the Future Part 1, guitar lays that sound reversed on Part 2, and that's not even touching the superb guitar melodies until it's done 2-2, the burbling melody and horns on Betray My Heart, just so good there, and the clipped guitars and bells on Prayer, or the fluttering arpeggios from the guitars and the pianos on the very soulful Another Life. I can't even level my usual complaint against D'Angelo that his material can drag or lose momentum, because this might be one of the most tight and intricate collections of compositions that he's ever dropped. Now, if I were to point out a few instrumental moments that I didn't precisely love, they'd be in some of that lingering eerie synth oscillation at the back of Prayer, or the whistles on Door. Sure, they recalled a lot of the old school blues, and the guitar work had a ton of texture there. They just didn't quite blend as well with the rest of the album, just saying. And now on to lyrics and themes. And let me say right out of the gate that I really do like how D'Angelo presents his more sexual tracks on this album. Not quite explicit, but they're steeped in genuine passion that makes the simplicity in the lyrics really work. There are a few lines that did raise my eyebrows, especially on Ain't That Easy and Sugar Daddy, especially with that line about pussy farts, but that's pretty much par for the course of this sort of R&B. It's pretty easily ignored. But it's the political tracks and the social commentary tracks on this album that really grip me. D'Angelo said he rushed this record's release date to get it out in 2014 given the social climate this year for the black community in the United States, and his political moments on this album hit hard. The courage of 1,000 deaths, the potent social commentary of the charade Until It's Gone 2-2 that touches on existentialism. These moments don't just feel fresh and relevant, but soulful and powerful that recalls many similar anthems of the mid-70s. I will say that he could have done a little bit more with Prayer. It's an adaptation of the Lord's Prayer from Christianity, and I get the feeling that a little more could have been done with the text there in order to better help that message. There are potent religious themes there, but he could have taken it a little further. But more than anything else, most of this album surrounds themes of D'Angelo's return to the spotlight. Hesitation, often placed through metaphors of longing for that past simplicity when it was easier, whether in relationships or in the success that he obtained. He longs for that old fire and passion to return, and if this album isn't plenty of evidence that fire is back in force, I don't know what is. Folks, this album is something special. One of the rare comeback albums that isn't just a match for his old material, but one that feels fresh, new, and vital all the same. It's not an incredibly dense record lyrically, but it doesn't need to be. This is a record that grips something deeper in the soul, and for me, it really worked. A strong 8 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation. Folks, this is the real deal, and something that many have been waiting over a decade and a half to see. If you want a record that breathes potent soul, look up Black Messiah by D'Angelo and the Vanguard. I promise you won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. One more album review, and of course Billboard breakdown, and then we're off to our list. If you want to put in that one suggestion for what that album should be, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.